Thanos to Theos is a new podcast in the Rooted Podcast Network that features conversations ranging from ministry and theology to comics and culture.
Welcome back to Thanos to Theos. We are a podcast that talks about culture and comics and its intersect in youth ministry and theology. We are all youth pastors, people in student ministry, but we're also we share a common love for comics, hence the name Thanos to Theos. My name is Clark, and I'm a pastor here in San Francisco doing worship and college ministry.
My name's Mike, and I'm a youth pastor in the general Boston area, just south of Boston.
My name's Kevin, and I serve at a Korean American church 20 minutes north of Los Angeles.
Now, you can see this is the first episode that we're doing video with.
Woo-hoo!
We're trying a new thing. You can see all of us here in our geeky comic backgrounds, except for Mike and just his books. But the reason why is because we have our very first special guest on the podcast, Mr. Bryan Brown. Why don't you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about who you are?
Hey everyone, my name is Bryan Brown, and I'm a youth pastor in San Francisco, extremely diverse church there. I also work with our young adults group.
Cool. Thanks for being with us, Bryan. So the main reason why we asked Bryan to join on with us is because we have been planning for this episode to talk about race and representation in comics and culture long before the events that happened the last couple weeks. But we knew it was something that we wanted to talk about given where comics are and our culture is, but especially with these events, with George Floyd's killing, with the protests going on, we really wanted to bring on a Black brother to learn from him, to hear his voice, and just to also have a diverse set of voices in this show, in this podcast, as we talk about a topic that I think is really necessary today. And so, we will maybe get into some of the heaviness, but we're a podcast that likes the fun and enjoyment of comics, so we'll keep that there as well. So Bryan, as our very first special guest, we want to start it off by asking you, who's your favorite superhero and what draws you to the world of comics?
Yeah, so, I feel like since I'm wearing a Captain America shirt, I have to say Captain America, right?
So, no, you can say whoever you want. You can choose better if you choose.
Yeah, I could choose better. But, I'm going to say definitely Captain America / Black Panther. Those are two definitely, I guess you could say, the phase 1 and then phase 2 favorite person. You can go from there. Yeah. So, and what drew me to comics, I just love the aspect of just the superhero aspect, the good nature of it, the fight versus good versus evil, and in particular as seeing the Marvel movie comics go, it's like you get a little bit more of a backstory of the villains and what inspires them a little bit about who they are. So. Yeah, I love stories, and it's a little bit of escape, even though sometimes they bring in some really big cultural things or issues within the movies. But I enjoy it overall. It's like if I'm sitting around doing nothing, I'm going to throw on a movie related to a comic or superhero movie for sure. So
yes,
nice.
So let me throw in, who's your favorite villain?
Ooh, of all time or an MCU?
Your favorite MCU villain? Or MCU, it could be Marvel or DC or just comic book villain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, when I watched The Joker for the first time, that was the Heath Ledger Joker. Let me clarify. That to me was that was actually the scariest villain at the time that I've ever experienced. Most of the other ones would seem a little bit fluffy, or they do some things that might scare you, but he himself, his presence and his aura felt different to me. So I liked him. And then surprisingly, Killmonger, another one, he also, I felt like had a presence about him that I was just like, it's different. It feels a little more real, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
You should have been on our The Joker and Antiheroes podcast.
I knew you were going to jump on that one, Clark.
Clark, can you stop trying to make people watch bad movies?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so.
We won't go there. Don't worry. You can listen to that episode later if you want about why Mike is too scared of the Joker.
Yeah.
So which Joker? The new one or
the new one? The new one.
New one. Yeah. I saw that one, and that was definitely, it takes you through a lot. So
yeah. Yes,
I just like hope. I just like there to be some hope, okay?
Yeah.
It's not just scaredy cat. I just want some hope.
All right. We'll give you more credit, Mike.
No, you won't. It's okay. It's okay.
You know what?
It's
I
all
was
good.
talking with some friends and just some ministry friends, and I was like, I felt like that Joker was a representation of the city.
Yeah.
You know, like
yeah.
you see a little bit of everything, especially the city that I'm in, San Francisco.
Yep.
I mean, you know, like it made me think twice when I would walk by someone on the street, like, I wonder what their story is. I wonder how they got here.
Yeah.
Totally.
Or the person talking to himself, you know, all that kind of stuff. You're like, okay. And then I was like, okay, that movie was scary, so I'm going to run.
It's too heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah, too heavy. Like, let's go.
Yeah. Cool. Well, so let's kick it off with this topic, race and representation in comics. Race is one of these things that's often been, talked about as not being well represented in the comic world. Obviously, comics and even the comic movies to some extent, they were largely born out of a white male narrative. Most of them actually, interestingly, being Jewish writers. So there is still this idea of oppression that comes out in their writing of the comic heroes. But nonetheless, we don't really see a whole lot of diversity in the comic writing until, honestly, probably like we get to the Black Panther in the 70s. And then especially recently, the last 5 years or so, we're seeing more diversity come out as our culture is becoming more aware of it. And as these writers are realizing that there has been an underrepresentation. So for us, as we hit off this topic, why does race and representation matter in comics? And why do you guys think this has been such a big issue? Because I remember even when they first started coming out with like Amadeus Cho, the Korean Hulk, Lady Thor, when they came out with Kamala Khan, these were, a lot of people didn't like it actually because it was reinventing the characters they loved. And they were saying, well, how can you do that to these beloved heroes? But why is it important and why do we need to pay attention to that, especially when it comes to the world of comics?
Well, I can go. I think the having some sort of representation, it just seems really important to people, especially when I think of like things that you watch. Like I've been reading and hearing a lot of stories about people being inspired just by seeing someone who looked like them or dressed like them, especially when you're watching something on TV, because that's our main medium now, right? Or Netflix or whatever way we consume the different mediums. But yeah, I just definitely feel like when you're able to see someone who looks like you, you're able to identify with it more, and it's not so far-fetched. Like I heard that a lot in particular when friends of mine watched the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse,
Yes.
and how just like the Latino culture was represented there.
Yeah.
And it was just like refreshing. I mean, I know people that were so inspired just by seeing someone who looked like them or had a story that they could relate to on the screen. They're like, yeah, like I relate to this Spider-Man so much more than the other Spider-Mans. And not that they didn't, right? They liked those Spider-Mans enough to be drawn in. But when they saw someone who looked like them, I just heard so much inspiration. And, some people even brought them to tears when I talked with them about it. And even the same with Black Panther movie, the same type of thing, which is, I think when people see someone that they can relate to, identify with, they're more likely to want to, watch it and consume it and take it in. But then I also hear like the flip side too, right? Where it's just like this character was never like that. Why? That's just kind of weird.
Right.
It also could like I don't know about it from that perspective. I haven't talked too much to people about that, but I can see how that could be maybe a barrier or even just kind of like people have questions like, well, how does this change this person's narrative?
I think especially with the whole representation you're talking about, Brian, I think for a lot of people, when we would read comics earlier, it was always, kind of the white hero, the white savior, and then the Black, Latino, Asians were the, standbyers, or they were the ones in peril, or they were the villains. And so I think the reason this is really important is because it finally showed people that, hey, even though we may be a nation that is dominated by white people still, and white's still the majority, so we understand some of that nuance, but heroes are not just one color. They're not just one type of person. And it just helped people realize like not being painted in one light or the other. And I think that's a lot of what the conversation is right now with the whole race conversation is, who's the villain, who's the hero? Well, it doesn't always have to be one color or the other. And I think especially, I remember talking with my friends, being half Asian, but with white face, I didn't struggle with this as much. Mine was more of an internal battle, but I had a lot of Asian friends growing up who would just say like, man, why are all the superheroes like white? Like, who do we have to look to? And for them, it was mainly like, I guess, like Jackie Chan or Shang-Chi and the Avengers. But now we have like the Hulk, Amadeus Cho. I think there's the new Spider-Gwen is Asian, right? Or Korean. I'm forgetting her name. But I think it matters just to like you said, to help even little kids, because comics are so formative for us as kids, to see someone who looks like us to represent us, not just so that we can say, hey, yeah, that's us, but also the way we're being formed and trained in the way we think about society.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good. When I was growing up, there wasn't comic book movies. Well, they were, but they were really bad. But we had the animated, like the Fox X-Men animated series. We had those types of things, cartoons and stuff like that. But
Still the best theme song ever.
yes, for sure. But the interesting thing to me is that like actually I didn't think about it until really recently, but I think my parents didn't like the fact that the heroes in my life were all sort of majority culture. There was no like Asian heroes. And so I think my dad subconsciously tried to get me to look for like Asian heroes on the screen. And so I remember watching, and this wasn't just because my dad liked this stuff, but I remember him like making me watch like Bruce Lee stuff and Jackie Chan stuff and Jet Li stuff, because to him, I think it was important that he saw that he showed me that there were masculine heroes that were of Asian descent on the screen that could really kick some butt. And I remember thinking about it now because I was in like 3rd grade or 4th grade or something, which is for some of the more comedic kung fu stuff, it's fine. But some of that was probably a little really inappropriate.
Violent.
Because it's pretty
totally.
violent.
Yeah.
It is.
But I think he just wanted to do that. And mind you, like I kind of grew up during the time of the LA riots too. So I think there was also a little bit of that, like, how do I show my 2 sons that like there are heroes of Asian descent, and I remember that specifically. So I think in terms of comic books and representation, like all of that stuff's really important.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, obviously, as the white dude,
I'm half with you.
Right? Yeah, but like, it's been really interesting to watch this turn where there's a black Spider-Man and a black Iron Man. I think I might actually like Ironheart, Riri Williams. I might like her even more than Miles Morales, and I love Miles Morales. But the Ironheart series, like, dude, that is awesome. When that drops in the MCU, it's going to be bonkers.
Yes.
It's going to be awesome because she's just phenomenal. But when a lot of these comics started coming out, I mean, I remember a bunch of people and even wondering myself, like, okay, so they're just changing the ink color that they're drawing these superheroes with. Like, I don't get it. But then when they started coming out with like Miles Morales and these other characters, and they gave them a real story that was different from the other heroes that I'd read, I was like, all right, so like these are like real, like whole new takes and perspectives and cultures that they're bringing to the heroes that is really compelling. Is like super interesting. So like I'm totally in on it. But when that shift first started happening, I'm not gonna lie, there was some part of it that's like, dude, like don't take Spider-Man from me, take your own hero, right? Like make someone new, like don't just reboot them and change the skin color. But like they took something that was familiar and made it new and fresh, and I think that is like really meaningful and interesting, and I think there's a lot to learn from that. So I'm totally in.
Which is what I think was the brilliance of the Into the Spider-Verse movie.
Yeah.
Because you had the melding of the old versions of Spider-Man and the new version of Spider-Man. And it was such a smooth introduction. But at this point, like, I'm looking forward to the sequel and seeing what else Miles can do.
Yeah.
And it was such an amazing, I think, introduction to the
Yes.
whole world, the whole character, and just a super fresh take on all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and to be honest, I was there with you too, Mike. When they first introduced Lady Thor, I was like, "What?
Yeah.
Don't do that to Thor!" Like, and then when they
Right.
did Miles Morales, I heard about Miles Morales coming out, and I was like, I'm gonna stick with the original Spidey. And it really, honestly, wasn't until Into the Spider-Verse came out, the movie, where they had that nice handing off, that I was actually intrigued by the character. So I think this is even internal for me. And many of us who are minorities, we even kind of carry this idea where we have to latch on to the white savior because we're so used to it. And there's honestly a lot of things that we love and aspire to. And so we even choose that over against our own minority representation sometimes. Maybe because of how we're conditioned, maybe even just because what we're used to. And we're even carrying that prejudice against our own people into the way we're consuming media, ironically enough.
It's very interesting that you say that. I think that's definitely something that, I've seen a lot of people wrestle with, and friends and family wrestle with, like you're saying, like, even wanting to change characters and whatnot. You're like, no, like, this is who this person is, right? Like, I want to keep this. Like, I have memories. I have, all these different experiences attached to that person. And
right.
It can be hard to release some of that to go towards something new, So, I totally relate to that, and I can hear that.
Yeah. Can you guys think of some other positive examples of seeing this racial representation in the world of comics or MCU, or even when it comes to like our areas of ministry and culture?
Well, I didn't want to do the Jesus juke. I learned that from previous episodes from you guys. I was thinking, like, just what I said before. Like, I think about like the new, like the old wineskins, new wineskins type thing. That's the perspective that I think about that when I think about replacing a new person with it's like just almost like a new character, new development, new, just everything is about it is new. And you want, if you're going to go that route, you need to go all in, right? You can't have a little bit of the old. And so when I think about this, like, especially relates to the culture and like the church, I think for a lot of people, I've heard a desire to see people and relate to people who are like them, in a church context. Like, it's particularly even more now on stage. If I can say on stage, I don't. Your church might not meet that way, but whoever's represented up front, or the leadership that people will look to for direction. I feel the conversation I have with people, a lot of people are looking for someone who looks like them, just to know that they are seen, that they're heard, and like they're more willing to maybe start with that person, even though they might still go to direction to someone who's majority culture in whatever culture you're in. And I say majority culture that way, not necessarily like white, black, because I had to grow in learning about majority culture and minority cultures in other ethnicities and other cultures worldwide. Like, being in the church that I'm in, I just didn't know. For example, one of my good friends got married, and his family's from Taiwan, and then her family was from Hong Kong. I had no idea that there's tension between those countries. I was like, oh, like, that is, my mind's like blown, from that. So I've had to learn to kind of see how I see all situations. Friends of ours I talked to last night, he's Indian from India, and her family's from Hong Kong, and they've had what they would call intercultural issues within their marriage. Nothing terrible or anything like that, but like they had to work through those things. Whereas from the outside, if you see from the outside, you're like, oh well, they're both Asian, so they're fine, right? And so it's definitely a lot of I could see how representation and connecting with people is really important to the grand scheme of things for the church. It makes you kind of think of Paul as he's talking about his, to how he relates to different people, right? To the Jew, he's a Jew, etc. And And it also makes me think of just a lot of different instances in Scripture where you see the church represented, but when you do study about the names that Paul is mentioning, you're like, man, this is a really diverse church. It's not all just the Jewish community. It's not all just the Gentile.
Yeah. I think it's good you mentioned, too, the idea of majority culture where you are, because I think too often when we talk about race, in our context in America, it does tend to be, I mean, it is white majority versus minority, and usually black people. But, you know, we see the same type of lack of representation and even oppression, whatever you want to call it, around the world. Like China has this history of, you know, the Chinese Han people underrepresenting and even oppressing the minorities in China. And so I think that's good to be culturally aware of, that, you know, there are majority and minority issues everywhere, not just between white and black relations. And I think for us, the world of comics in our American context, it's helping shed light on that, actually, through these, you know, people of color heroes.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to move the conversation into you know, church leadership and pastoral ministry, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that representation matters, right? And so I live in the suburbs, you know, not huge ethnic diversity in, you know, the areas where I live. So obviously my church is largely white. I think we're roughly as diverse as the community that we're in. But that's still like almost like probably like over 90% white. So what can we do grow in our you know, diversity and in our representation? If, you know, in the elder board, there's just not a whole ton of diversity within the church, and, you know, you don't want to have someone on the elder board just kind of as like a token, right?
Token, yeah.
Like
Tokenism.
if they're not like spiritually qualified to be an elder, because they know that, like, they can see and understand, like, look, like, I'm just your token, like, you don't really, my voice doesn't really matter here. So what can we learn from this time of you know, the protests and the calling for change? Do you have any advice or counsel, Bryan, for me and my church, and kind of what can we learn and grow?
Yeah. So I would say on an individual level, it's definitely like if your community doesn't reflect the diversity, it's like, how can you build friendships and connections with people who might pastor another church or pastor a youth group in a city close by and nearby you? And just start with like a pastor to pastor connection there, like learn to listen to maybe like how they do their youth group, what issues that they see in their context, and then, you know, vice versa. Like not just a one-way street, but, you know, I think when you're listening, right, it's one person hearing the other person, but then you also want to have a conversation where it's two-way street where you both are going and engaging. So I would say, like, for friends in that situation, like befriend someone, another pastor, another you know, elder in a different church, and just build that relationship between you all. Learn to see the world as they see it, see ministry as they see it, and then vice versa. Go both ways and encourage each other that way. And then from there, like, I think another big thing that I think is seeing is eventually you'll get to the point where you learn how to pray for that person. They learn how to pray for you, and you start to see some things. And maybe like do things together as one, you know, like tackle an issue together that affects something in your area. You know, work together as one. Like I think of the verses where Jesus is praying for unity. And as we all know, like just being in church world, just because you have one body, like, you know, me, church in San Francisco, doesn't mean we're unified just because we gather together and worship together. Right. But when I think of unity, I think of even a bigger picture than that, right? Like not just my one church, but how can I be unified as the church in San Francisco as a whole? You know, I had conversations with Clark, for example, with that. Like that was just a spark of our friendships. Like, man, like what things are you seeing in the city? What issues do you see? How can I encourage you? How can I help you? Like, how can we maybe try to do something together as one, and show that we're unified tackling this issue? So it's, the church in San Francisco, not this, First Baptist Church, right? So those are, I think, the big things I think are important. And then you're taking it maybe to like even another level, connecting with, like let's say you start to engage a community, a different ethnic community in your own community, and as you start to reach them, you're modeling that. I think one big thing, like you will model that for your community if that is a desirable thing, and which I think is a biblical thing. But I think I say desirable. Sometimes things could be biblical, and where our heart is not right. Right. God needs to work on us, prepare us to go out and to reach the nations and the people, and not have a create like a us first them mentality. But I think as God does the work in you, and you connect with another church, and maybe some people are starting to come to your church, I think the back end is preparing your people for when the diversity starts to come. And that's something I personally ran into at a church I was in Denver, where I was modeling to my church, like, here's how you connect cross-culturally. Like the church I was at, we met in a school, and the school had 44 different languages spoken within that school, native languages. So the community was extremely diverse. So we had to learn how to share the gospel in different ways that connect with different people. And I realized that a lot of the people from the community who weren't connected to our church, didn't know Christ, maybe were another religion, loved me. And then when they came to the church, they didn't stay or get connected or love the church body. And I think a big part of that was I needed to grow and teach in my church body, and preparing them for the steps to connect with those who don't look like us, don't talk like us, don't dress like us, might have a different religion or perspective about life, and then teach them biblically how to engage, love and support them, and ultimately speak about Christ with them. And that was something that I learned the hard way that I needed to do better at. I was good doing that, modeling that for myself, but I wasn't bringing people along with me. So when I reached the different community and brought them, they actually came out to our church. Like, I went to them and we engaged for a while, and they actually started showing up. My community wasn't ready for that. And that was definitely hard. For example, like this, we were, there's a specific community that was coming out to that church, and people had unique names and things of that nature, and people from my church would always ask me, so what are their names again? How do you pronounce that? And like they've been coming to church for like 3-4 months, and the church was, there was plenty of opportunity for them to connect and make relationship, but they didn't take that step. And so that's where I learned, like, I need to grow in doing that, modeling it for my church, but maybe in small ways, incremental ways, building upon it and showing them the need for it, so that when you start to bring people together, groups together, they can do something greater than you can just do by yourself.
So it sounds like that's really good to mention, because I think for those of us that maybe feel like we are more privy to the culture race conversation, or we've been in it, we just want to like jump in. But we have to remember we're also leading people that may have never thought about it or been aware of it until, honestly, maybe now with, you can't avoid it now on social media or anywhere you go on the news. But like taking that step of education, I guess. And I think that's what so much of this movement on social media is. It's a first step in education. But I think, like you said, too, the best education is not just, distanced from a screen or from a book, but up in person, talking with and interacting with someone with a personal story. So it's not just this like theory or theoretical thing out there, but something we can connect with personally and put a name and face to.
Yeah. And I love your suggestion about finding a church in a nearby city, and kind of building a partnership. So you're not just going there to do service projects, because then then you're just the white savior church. But to like build a partnership and to actually become friends. And do stuff together, like do fun things together. And if there is a need for a service project then you serve and do it together, not just for them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I love that suggestion.
Yeah.
I think
Can
it's
you
gold.
speak to that a little bit more, Brian? Because I think for a lot of people, especially in this time, a lot of people are becoming aware of the issues.
Right.
And I think a lot of people honestly do want to start moving towards steps of action, being an ally, being a friend. But because for so long, we've had this narrative where like the Black people are the poor communities and we in the white and even Asian communities have to go and help them because we're privileged and we have wealth, right? How can we help ourselves and lead our people to be allies and friends and help and support in a way that still maintains individual dignity and not maintaining this paternalistic, white savior or privileged mentality?
Yeah.
Well, and can I add a part B to that question?
Yeah.
Is how do you start that conversation as the leader, reaching out to the other church in a way that isn't just like,
doesn't
dude,
come
like
off,
you're just reaching out now because of all this political stuff, and you're just posturing yourself to make yourself look good.
Yeah, no, that's
For
good.
sure,
Right?
sure.
Like how do you actually make that phone call or send that email?
Yeah. So I would say one is be persistent. The reason why I say that is just as you guys mentioned, like it's going to be hard initially because people have been burned in the past.
Right.
So as people have been burned themselves, they aren't going to be as open, right? And I heard this analogy talking about culture. It's like peach and a coconut. I don't know if you guys have heard this analogy before, but someone taught me this and it's stuck with me forever. Sorry if I'm stealing someone's work. I don't know who
it's yours now.
Started it or anything like that. But so basically, when it talks about cultures, it's talking about one like a peach. Like peach is really soft when you bite into it, and then you get down to the core and it's really hard, right? And like someone who is like culturally like a peach, like you can have like small talk conversations with them. You have a lot of different ways of connecting with them. You feel like you get to know them. But really, you haven't hit their core yet, so you really don't know them, even though you think that you know them. Whereas cultures that are more like a coconut, it's like very, very hard to break in. Like the shell takes a long time to really break through that to get to the person. But once you break that shell, you got all of them, right? That you're seeing the real person. There is no fluff or anything like that. And I would say for a lot of minority communities, we're definitely more on the coconut side, where we've harden ourselves to anyone who's different than us because of experiences that we've had or beliefs that because of things that we've seen. And so it's going to take, I think, a lot of work, a lot of consistency, and realizing that like people are going to be watching you. Like I like to tell my youth group, like the people who aren't Christians are watching your walk with Christ to see if you really believe what you believe. And so if you as a church are trying to build another relationship with the church and build unity, the church that is not your church is going to be watching you to see if you really want to be unified. And there's going to be different ways that you might be tested, which they could vary based off whatever circumstances, right? But they're really going to see if you're about unity or really going to see if you're about yourself or have a savior complex. So I think it's probably going to take a little bit more time than you think, unless you have a person of peace in that culture already that you kind of know, or a friend of a friend, which you can build that connection. So then I would say the most interesting thing too is I would say look for things that aren't necessarily race baited to connect with the people. Like I've had a lot of times where I'll go and I'll be in a situation hanging out and, I'm the only Black person in the sea of a variety of different races. And particularly what's happened to me is, I'll give a little bit of backstory here, actually. I grew up in a context where I was the only African-American to graduate from my high school class. And I was all majority white. The rest of the school, like there was 25 of us minorities in a school of 700. So
wow. It sounds like you grew up in my neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Not too far from you, probably like a few hours away, right? But when when I go into those contexts, there's certain contexts where I'm hanging out with people and I'm just seeing people for people, right? Like I'm not like recognize your skin, your culture, all that kind of stuff, but I'm just looking at you for who you are.
Yeah.
But I can tell people who are uncomfortable with me or just kind of like trying to figure out how they can relate to me. So they'll start talking about different things that are like Black culture that they know nothing about, and you can tell immediately that they know nothing about, you know. So it's like, yeah,
Like they're trying so
like,
hard to relate. It's just showing their ignorance.
right. It's
like,
you know,
I
heard
love
this rap
Tupac.
song.
I loved Black Panther, Brian.
I love Tupac.
Yes, right. And the funny thing is I don't think they actually realize that they're doing that. Like,
Right.
some majority of them actually didn't realize that they're doing that. And so I would, you know, at some points like to play along with it. Like, okay, let me see if they really know what they're talking about. And then you're like, yeah, this guy doesn't know. So I'm like, yeah, this is great. But anyway, I think that's a big thing. Is it's easy for us to like know like the thing that inspired you to even think it's about outside of yourself is race related, but then you want to go in with that hard topic. And some people might engage you with that, but most people are just like, I just want to know who you are. Like, you know, like for this podcast, right? We're talking about like comics and culture and youth, like all those things. Like I immediately related to all of you guys on those things, right? And listen to you talk about Captain America or Joker or Thor or all that kind of stuff. Like it just made me be like, I know you, and I feel like we're already friends, right? And so those different ways that we can connect that aren't necessarily the hard, heavy stuff, I think lead to ways that you can get into a culture and get into a community. And then, like I said, being consistent with it. You know, like, yeah, you might have shown up for like one event or you brought your church out for one event, but like, will you call or connect with that person to follow up to see how they're doing? Or, you know, like, what ways can I be praying for you? Or, you know, like, we planned this event, you guys came out to us, like, let us go to you. You know, there's different things to show that you guys are in it together. And
That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like we really should be brushing up on all our comic books and MCU so we can build that bridges. You know what I mean? So this podcast is useful for so many things, guys.
So much.
It is.
Tip of the spear, creating these bridges and all that.
Yeah.
So much wisdom here.
Yeah. And honestly, Brian, I think that's something I've just appreciated about our friendship. You've been really welcoming, inviting to me. You've never made it like weird, you know, me coming from white and Asian background, you being Black. And like we just connected because we were the only two youth pastors in the room at that TGC meeting, I think, right? Like we're like, hey, there's another gospel-centered youth pastor, like we got to hang out.
Absolutely.
But then slowly over time, as we've gotten to know each other more, we've heard each other's stories. Like I've gotten to know more about your upbringing as it's come up, and I've really valued our friendship to learn more. And again, like to have a personal story and face to the race conversation, where it's not just like, oh man, it's out there. But you know, I know you, like we've hung out, and it's not just about race, but just friendship. Right.
Absolutely.
I think another thing that I think about too, going back to this whole like race in comics, for as much as I think the comic world was a product of its time, you know, white men writing comics for a white audience, I really do have to give credit to Stan Lee and Marvel Comics when they started writing Black Panther. Because I think it was almost like parallel with the Black Panther movement during Civil Rights. Maybe it was a little bit after, I can't remember. But I remember I was reading something about this where they were saying that Stan Lee was kind of visionary in setting up Wakanda as this, you know, hidden, technologically super advanced, like leaders of the world's country within Africa. Because everyone always saw, and still to this day probably sees Africa as this, you know, poor country, continent that we need to go into and help. And yet Stan Lee envisioned this world where Africa was the leading power.
Like beneath all the surfaces of it, like they are better than you.
Yeah. I mean, it's true, right?
Yeah,
like,
I wasn't saying it.
Hey man, But I think just seeing that and like just kind of thinking that Stan Lee could envision this world of dignity for the Black person and you know, like not just coming from a place of need, but they were also coming from a place of having something to offer. And I think that's important to remember too, like, especially in this, where we are today, we want to be allies, and we want to help. And, you know, all the systemic things involved will need to have white majority people and people in authority pushing forward, but that doesn't mean we devalue or lower the dignity of the Black person, the minority person's ability to lead and bring something to the table. And in fact, probably what they have to bring will be much better to offer than what's been said, because it'll be unique than what's already been said by the majority culture.
Can I speak into that real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
It's actually pretty. Thank you for bringing that up. It sparked a very good memory actually for me. So me and my family, it's just like we have a unique family situation. So my mom was married to someone else, got divorced, but had my older brother, older sister. Then there's me. Then we adopted my younger sister. Then my little brother was a surprise, right? So 5 kids were all over the place. Wow. And there's like 22 years between my oldest brother and my youngest brother.
Oh wow!
Right. Wow. So that's we're a big a generational sibling family. Yeah, I mean seriously. And it was super cool. It was in 2018. My niece was getting married, and we all got together. And that weekend, Black Panther came out. And so we're all like, hey, let's go and watch Black Panther. And it was surprising to me how much the crowd and my family, were so attached to the film that I think they forgot it was a Marvel movie. Mm. I don't know if you ever heard that perspective before, but there are friends of mine and my family were like we were almost offended that there was a Marvel theme connecting that to the creator of Marvel movie. And I think people forgot, hey, it's just not just a Wakanda thing. Because like you said, like a lot of people, African American people like myself, we know a little bit about our culture and our heritage and our background, but we don't fully know that. So it's we don't really know necessarily where we're from. Even when we do a test, ancestry test, which those increased for African Americans after the Black Panther movie because people wanted to know where they were from. Wow. A lot of all of my family members are we need to find out our family roots, where we came from. Wow. Let's learn about this. Let's grow in this. And the reason why I think we brought it up, it reminded me of this excellent conversation my family had between all of us. 20-year gap. It's one of the best conversations we ever had as siblings, talking about race, talking about ancestry, talking about how my family members would see that scene where T'Challa is coming in, and you don't know that there's the high tech force field protecting them as they fly into Wakanda, and just that scene and the sun and all that kind of stuff there. It's just so beautiful. I've even heard other people talk about Wakanda is my home, right? Because I don't know where I'm from. I'm not going to pay to do a ancestry test. Wakanda is where I'm from.
I'm from Wakanda.
Right? Exactly. And so for the Black community, it was really interesting. I think why the movie blew up the way that it did was the Black community went back and back and back because they're well, this feels like home. This feels like something I can fully relate to. I mean, even the Killmonger character, right? For me personally, there are times and some things that he said that you're oh, wow, I've maybe thought that or heard that before, and I'm he's saying some real cultural things in the African American community, and at the same time you're I love T'Challa and who he is and how he just represents righteousness in a way, and stands up for what is right, even when it's going to cost him something, and is willing to open up his home and all those different things. It's just crazy. It's just crazy to see all that. But after that movie, we had the best family conversation I've ever had, and it was totally related to our ancestry and representation and just the home that people said that is somewhere I attach to. And when I think about that, going a little back to the Jesus juke. When I feel back to that for scripture, I think for a lot of the African American community, a lot of times people can get so down and be America doesn't feel like my home. I don't have a home. When we think about that from the Christian perspective, it's our home is not here. Our home is in heaven, right? And we are all alieners and foreigners and strangers here. on the earth. And so for me, at times when like the culture right now is really heightened and all the things that are going on and people are fighting for, you know, representation and fighting for against big issues that, you know, may or may not ever be fully ratified or corrected. It's like, you know, I have that hope in Christ that is where my ultimate home is. That is where my ultimate peace and joy and place that I'll be looking for is. And so like it helps me tackle whatever issues that are going on today here that relate to me culturally. And it helps encourage me to teach that to the church. You know, like there's a lot of things we attach our own representation to or identity to or hope in that ultimately we need to point that towards Christ.
Amen.
Dude, you need to write an article about that for Rooted,
man.
because that is like serious. That is so rich.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, as a white dude, like that's just not something I really understand or think about unless from you kind of force me to think about it. So yeah, like that's got my head spinning. That's really good. Like that sense of home. And what that represented in Black Panther and yeah, that's good stuff.
Thanks, man.
I love that movie so much because I love that it wasn't like part of the good guys' arguments with each other within the Panther team and the Wakandans was this idea of shouldn't we be helping those on the outside? And I love that because that's such a conversation that we're just not having because we tend to, again, minimize those who are minorities, you know, without realizing that the minority cultures have so much to offer. And I love that that's what a big chunk of the movie was about. And I just, so in that sense, like, I think I watched the movie 3 times in theaters because I just love the hope that was a part of it. And I just love the Afrofuturism in that movie is so cool. I mean, just the designs and all that kind of stuff. I think the music too, like, come on, in Infinity War, when you heard the Wakanda theme, like you just knew where you were going to.
Like,
it was so distinct.
It is on.
Yes, it's like exactly. So it's all that, and it's just like super exciting, you know.
Yeah.
So I can't wait for Black Panther 2 for sure. But it makes me hopeful that Marvel knows what they're doing with regards to even something like Shang-Chi, which is kind of a stereotype.
It is.
Right.
It's just so I'm nervous about it, you know.
Same.
But at the same time, I'm like, well, look at what they did with Black Panther, and that was so hopeful and so inspiring and so motivating. And I'm hoping that, you know, with Shang-Chi, they do kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
All right, so talk to me about that then. Like, what are some of your concerns about stereotypes and racism in like something like Shang-Chi?
It's a good question.
Because honestly, I've never even heard of Shang-Chi before. Like,
He's
3 months
basically
ago.
Jackie Chan in the
like
Marvel
a Bruce Lee,
universe.
Jackie Chan,
Like Bruce Lee,
Yeah,
Like, so
basically.
I went back in Marvel Unlimited and read like Shang-Chi and the rings and everything.
The 10 rings,
I was like, oh, like this is kind of interesting. But like, there's nothing about him in the last 20 years or whatever. Like,
He's a
I've
side
never heard of
character.
him.
Yeah, he's not a major character, but they're
No.
making him one.
Yeah.
And I think the MCU's strength actually is taking people who are unexpected and like making them a big deal, you know? Like, so I think that's kind of cool. So I'm, again, hopeful that will happen. But truth be told, like, the main thing is Iron Fist, the Marvel TV show on Netflix, was atrocious. I mean, it was, first off, it was boring.
It was bad writing.
Yeah, it's bad, right? Like just the whole team behind the scenes, creatively, you know, I'll say it was kind of stifling. And there was a whole, you know, controversy over whether the character Danny Rand should have been an Asian person. But I mean, if you're staying true to the character, it really is about a white. Yeah, it's about a white guy who goes and again learns the mystic arts from Asian people and uses, you know, our
their
way
best
of,
stuff and brings it back.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So same thing with Doctor Strange. You have those kinds of issues there too with, you know, and so. Yeah. So you're always nervous about those kinds of things, I think, and I have that like coming into it. Which is why when Jackie Chan movies started being released in America, like that was such a big deal. I saw Rumble in the Bronx like 5 times in the movie theaters, even though like it had been on VHS. Like I just went because I just wanted to see that on the big screen.
Oh, Rush Hour is like one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, for sure, right?
I love Rush Hour.
That was a good movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of the fears too is this character going to be not just like another foreign Asian person coming in and like with all like the stereotypical Asian tropes of like not speaking English well, only doing kung fu, like always just eating dumplings with chopsticks. Like as much as those are maybe true cultural elements to the Asian narrative, like when that becomes the main thing, it's again kind of feeling like Asian people are just put in this, same thing as a model minority myth, like putting Asians in one place, one spot, holding to the narrative. And if you stick to that narrative, you'll be fine. Don't rock the boat. So I think that's probably the fear for most Asian audiences when it comes to Shang-Chi. Or is this someone that's going to be actually demonstrated as having like hero-like qualities, going beyond just the Chinese stereotypes, and becoming a force within the MCU as a whole. So I think of even like the movie Crazy Rich Asians that did so well. It was because they actually really dealt with, and it had to be an Asian writer to do this, Asian American. They dealt with very real issues of Asian Americans that struggle with their home culture, being Chinese and yet being born in America and growing up here. And so this whole identity issue, so it was very real. I think similar to what you're saying, Brian, with like Black Panther, like there are real things that come up where you can say like, I've said that, I've thought that, like I've literally said those lines to myself or to someone else in my life. So to me, that's what will really show if they can do it in a way that actually does represent and is authentic to the culture and honoring it. And hopefully breaking some of the stereotypes rather than just, playing off the same old tropes over and over again. All right. So as we're continuing and starting to wrap up this conversation, one thing that's come up a lot, obviously 2 of us or 1.5 of us, you could say on this podcast, are Asian.
You count, Clark. You count.
I count. This question has always come up with, what about Asian-Black relations? How do Asians relate with the Black Lives Matter movement and being allies? And yet at the same time, like Asians have also received a lot of honestly just racial prejudice, even from Black people. And there's been tension there in the past. Yeah. So Kevin, it'd be great if you could share some of your thoughts and how do we think about that for ourselves, but also just as we think to our youth, how do they start to get involved and on a meaningfully way understand the issues and be an ally?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty complex, but I think the 2 things that I've been thinking about. So I was in '92, I was in 3rd grade, 4th grade-ish, and so I was like lower elementary school. But again, growing up, what I remembered most is the trauma that my parents and their generation received. Back then in LA, you didn't have as many people living in like outside of Koreatown. Like it was still in the heyday of a lot of immigration. You still had hundreds of thousands of Koreans coming in to LA all the time. So everybody worked in K-Town, even if maybe you did live in the suburbs. So everyone was connected in terms of the Korean community to what was happening in Koreatown. And so a lot of trauma. I remember like dad's friends like buying guns and talking about that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, so what are we supposed to do? And then at the same time, the school that I was going to was busing in Latino and Black students from the inner cities. And so all that tension was coming out to the suburbs as well. And so even as elementary schools, like we are shaped by the way our parents respond to stuff and the way our parents were responding. We carried that right into the games that we played in the schoolyard and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that was seminal for shaping the way that I thought about my relationship with Black people, Latino people. And I was bullied. I'm pretty honest about that now, but it's funny because I didn't really deal with that, I want to say, until last year when I started to really think about what's my reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. Like how do I understand what my place is in supporting anti-racist movements, but at the same time struggling internally with, but these are also people who have hurt me. And so how do I let go of that? And so I knew in my head racism is wrong, and this is something that I should be in support of. But at the same time, I don't think I dealt with a lot of the bitterness that had been growing in my own heart. really up until quarantine. One of the interesting things about this pandemic, and this is what I have been asking my students too, is, do you think that you would have cared so much about George Floyd had you not been locked up at home for the last 2 months?
Yep.
And just honestly, in a lot of weird, interesting ways, be faced with your own sin at home, the way you relate to your parents, the way you relate to your siblings, and now the way we relate to others in terms of our ethnic and racial biases.
Yeah, totally.
And I'm just like, I think God cares about this issue more than we do. Because if anything comes out of this pandemic, what if God paused everything so that we could really consider and think about, how we feel about this and how do we understand this issue? So there's been a lot of soul searching for me in the last week or so, and I've realized for me that I have been holding on to this bitterness, and I don't want to hang on to it. I think it's toxic, and I think that I have been leading my youth students incorrectly when it comes to this issue of racial reconciliation. And the way that I've been thinking about it personally is just, I want to strive for more than justice. I want to strive for reconciliation. And that requires me to do the internal heart work first.
Yeah.
Because I can fight for justice with the things that I do on the outside, but in terms of actual reconciliation, actual crossing the street, meeting somebody, hugging them, like being a friend and a true ally, that's going to take the internal heart work that I need to do on the inside. And I think that's something that I think God is beautifully bringing about in a lot of people. And I think this is such a good opportunity for us to do that internal work first, rather than shouting things on social media. So I think with regards to youth students, like that's a big part of it, because the movement it's awesome, like what you're seeing on social media, but at the same time, it is a bit shallow because I don't know that enough students are really internalizing this stuff first. So I think that's a major way in which youth leaders can lead their students through a lot of self-reflection. Because if we want this movement to last, it cannot be a social media flash in the pan. This is what's trendy. It's got to be something that we internalize. And so spiritually, we've got to do that work first. So we as youth leaders and youth workers, we have a huge opportunity right now to show how the Holy Spirit can transform us from the inside out.
Yeah, totally. It's awesome. And I think also, for the Asian kids, it's been really easy for them. Like I remember during the 2016 election, a lot of them were like freaking out, like, oh, Trump's going to just, destroy us and like destroy Black lives. And these are my Asian kids. And I remember confronting them with that and telling them like, well, it's easy to lob those bombs over, your digital media fences and at this, because this is primarily a white-black conversation. And it's easy for us to stand on the sidelines, be angry, and just from a distance, like throw our criticism and judgment. But I remember confronting them with the thought of, have you ever thought about your own racial prejudices towards white people, towards Black people? Like, have you ever stepped beyond your Asian community to interact with people not like you, not just, with simple small talk, but embracing them with friendships? And I think, to be honest, a lot of Asian communities haven't really done that. We've been on the sidelines, almost kind of like we can claim the innocence card, where we have no part in this. We claim innocence and we just judge both sides. But I do think for us to be good allies, we need to confront ourselves and our kids, our students and our own kids in our homes, with how have we been perpetuating racism and prejudices by not crossing those racial boundaries. And that's what, like you said, Kevin, I think that will really lead to this movement of even Asian people starting to leave our model minority mythical corner and coming to the public light to really stand for truth and be reconcilers ourselves, as you mentioned again.
Yeah. And it's, from my shoes, it sometimes feels like a lose-lose, but you got to try something. Like if you don't say something because you're listening, then you're wrong for not speaking up because you have a voice and you need to use it. But then you use your voice and you speak up and you say the wrong thing, or someone says, oh yeah, well, you say that now, but I remember this one time. So it's like, well, like if you're screwed either way, then like, what do you do? And I think that's where we need to just pray for wisdom, and pray for courage to say the right thing, not just the quick thing or the first thing that comes to mind. But to walk with courage, and with the humility, maybe that if someone calls us out and says, I think you're being hypocritical here, because I remember, situation X, to have the humility to face what you have added to the problem, and to own it, and to say, all right, I don't remember saying that, but I'm going to choose to believe you instead of defending myself, and genuinely apologize and try to learn and try to grow. Yeah. But from what I hear from a lot of my white friends, is, come on, man, I'm woke, right? I mean, I'm with it. I'm not part of the problem. And also this fear of saying the wrong thing. I mean, I even think about Aaron Rodgers, Twitter, and, he posted some comments in support, and now today he's being blasted for being hypocritical and just making his statements to sound good. And so it's like, well, like, what are you supposed to do when this is the example that's in front of you all the time? Because you have to do something and you have to speak up. And like, yes, like white privilege is a real thing coming from a very white man. Like it is a real thing. And it drives me crazy when people try to deny it. But like, you can't just live in fear of being misunderstood or of using the wrong words. Don't let fear keep you silent. But also don't just jump into the conversation to like virtue signal either, because that's just shallow and it.
Yeah, it's just lip service.
So I'm really thankful for this conversation with you guys. It's been very helpful.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Yeah, this is great. And just Kevin, I thank you for your honesty with all that too. I think all of us need a large amount of grace and repentance and apologizing during this season. Like that's one of the big things that I feel like God is doing in me, like as we work through this together as society. It's like if we want to actually be unified, if we want to actually see a change, then that means that we need to be giving each other grace. We need to, apologize for the wrongs that we've done, and then ask, and just reconcile together as a community, So it's a lot of work. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
So it's a lot. I think a lot of times people, like you mentioned, Clark, will want to say the right things, but they're not going to put in the work to actually make things right. So I pray that we do that and can model that.
Hey, well, thanks so much, Bryan, for coming on as our very first special guest. May not be the last time we tap your shoulder to come and join us too, talk about comics and youth ministry and theology. We're really grateful for the conversation, just the friendship that we get to have these conversations honestly here. The world of comics drawing us together, but also sharing that love of Christ, of our youth and youth ministry and all that. So thank you guys for tuning in. I really hope this was valuable and helpful, especially the season we're in. I know this has just been such a learning season for myself even, for all of us, just learning how to, like you mentioned, Bryan, grow in grace and humility, and just extend this hand of friendship across these racial lines. And hopefully that way, even like you mentioned, we can be a united church body that models that type of diverse love and friendship amongst one another for a watching world. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any other questions or comments, we'd love for you to reach out to us at Thanos to Theos, both on Twitter or Instagram, and also at gmail.com. Take care, guys, and hope you're staying safe out there.
Wash your hands.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thanos to Theos, part of the Rooted Network family of podcasts. For more resources designed to equip and encourage you to faithfully disciple students towards lifelong faith in Jesus Christ, be sure to find Rooted on the web at www.rootedministry.com.